This is the story of Ken McElroy, a man whose name carried fear through the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, long before it became part of one of America's most chilling unsolved cases. To people on the outside, Skidmore may have looked like any other quiet town, but for many who lived there, peace was fragile, and much of that tension seemed to gather around one man. Ken McElroy was widely feared. He was seen as aggressive, controlling, and deeply intimidating, the kind of person whose presence could change the mood of a place without him saying much at all. Over time, fear of him became part of daily life. His power did not come from admiration. It did not come from respect. It came from the belief that crossing him could cost you your peace, your safety, or both. Fear in Skidmore did not always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it was in lowered voices. Sometimes it was in the pause before saying his name out loud. Sometimes it was in the decision to mind your business, even when your heart told you something was wrong. And sometimes it looked like Ken McElroy parking outside someone's home and sitting there for hours, just to make sure they knew he was there. That kind of intimidation does something to people. It turns an ordinary evening into a long one. It makes curtains feel thinner. It makes a home feel less like shelter and more like a place being watched. He did not always need to act. Sometimes the threat was in the stillness, in the waiting, in the message that his presence alone was enough to disturb your sense of safety. That is what made the fear feel so personal. For many in Skidmore, this was not just about one man with a bad reputation. It was about living with a constant sense of unease, the kind that follows people into their homes, settles into family conversations, and teaches a town to be careful with its words. What made it even harder to bear was the feeling that the law never truly put an end to it. People talked in private. They worried in silence, and little by little, frustration grew beside the fear. Then, in July 1981, everything changed. Ken McElroy was sitting in his truck in broad daylight when gunshots rang out. It did not happen in secret. It did not happen in some hidden corner. There were people nearby, people who heard it, people who saw what came after. But when investigators arrived and questions began, the town gave them almost nothing. Nobody named the shooter. Nobody stepped forward with the truth investigators were looking for. And in the end, the killing of Ken McElroy remained unsolved. That silence is what gives this story its lasting weight. Because this case is not remembered only for the violence, it is remembered for what came after. A town that seemed to decide, together or apart, that some things would not be spoken aloud. Some people see that silence as a form of justice, from a community that had run out of faith in the system. Others see it as something darker, a sign of how fear, once left unchecked for too long, can reshape the moral boundaries of an entire town. And maybe that is why the story still lingers, not because it is loud, but because it is heavy. It is the story of a man who made people afraid, a town that carried that fear for years, and a moment when the silence afterward said more than words ever could. Because in Skidmore, after the gunshots faded, the loudest thing left behind was the silence. The silence in Skidmore still lingers, but the stories don't end there. If you want to uncover more tales of fear, crime, and unsolved mysteries, like this video and subscribe. Turn on notifications and step carefully into the next dark chapter.